Yeah, almost
I
there.
can't
The
really
button,
see
yeah,
it.
the button is here. Sorry if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead and do it for me.
Okay.
Y'all go ahead and
All
grab
right.
a seat. We're going to
Yeah.
try to get going, get started soon here.
All right. This is not as authoritative as a sound. We could do that, actually. You know, that's a good idea. I didn't think of that. Thank you for that. All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to RF. Welcome especially to a lot of people who are visiting us from off campus, either from Allen's Church or who are alumni. Great to see all of y'all today. Yeah, I'm glad you're all here. You'll notice that it's 7 days until our next heresy instead of since our last heresy. By the way, if you're new here, this is a joke that we have, that we count the days since our last heresy. But next week, Dr. Justin Bass is going to be with us to talk about heresies and creeds. So that is going to be a really interesting talk about, like, you know, what is heresy and why do we joke about it and all of that. So if you can make it next Tuesday night, that'll be a really fun talk. Tonight we're going to Brahms. This is Janky Thanksgiving that we do. It's going to be November 22nd, so in 2 Fridays. So make sure that you have that on your calendar. There will be an opportunity to just bring Janky college student Thanksgiving food. We'll have a sign-up sheet relatively soon, and that's just a time to hang out and nerd out. Is there anything else that I'm missing to announce? Yeah. Yes, probably it'll be in one of the on-campus clubhouses if we can make that happen. One thing that I did want to mention on a personal note is that some pastors at my church are looking to just register a student organization on campus so that they can host a service maybe 3 or 4 times next semester. And I'm in search of 1 or 2 people who would be willing to just have their names on the list as officers so that we can get that organization registered. There would be no responsibilities at all. You wouldn't notice that you're being an officer at all. But if you are willing to do that, just let me know before you leave, because it would be a really big help to me. Yeah?
I think you might have to not pay a nominal amount of attention to an SOC training video at one point.
I don't think you do, because I'll just do that. So you'll avoid it. So, you know, it's like you're advancing the gospel, and Jesus says, count the cost. There's no cost. Anyway, that would be really helpful. Alan is talking to us about logic tonight, so logically speaking, this is going to be a good talk. Go ahead.
All right, thanks a lot, Kenneth. So yeah, we're going to do something a little bit different. Usually we have some kind of evidence for God or Christianity, or we're looking at objections or another religion. But tonight we're going to kind of go at the foundational level and look at reason itself as a reasonable faith group. Obviously, that's a key part of what we do as well. We think faith can and should be reasonable, and we want to help people think deeply about these things. I mean, you look at some of the verses here, and you see that Christianity is based on loving God with your mind, for example. We're commanded to do that. Proverbs is very strong on wisdom, and even things, you know, like this is a very interesting verse, right? Examine all things, hold fast to what is good. We're not to just take in things without considering them. So we want people to have a foundation of truth that is very strong and that is based on the Bible, because we think the Bible is true. But we're also able, hopefully, to present arguments and evidence to people who are not Christians or maybe don't even believe in God, to help show them that, hey, there's some really major problems with atheism or naturalism. Here's some reasons why you need to consider that God really does exist. But in order to do those kinds of things, we need a foundation of understanding, well, how do you make arguments? Some people think religion itself is not about, you know, arguments and evidence. And by the way, by arguments, I don't mean being argumentative, but obviously just more in the philosophical sense of the term, where you're making a case for something. So our group is about Christian case making, or some people call it apologetics. But in order to make a case, you need to understand principles of logic in order to be effective at that. We don't want to be making bad arguments with holes in them, things like that. We need to understand logic. And actually, one of the things that we've gotten good feedback over the years when we ask people, like, what did you like or dislike about our group? Often people have said, well, you really taught us to think more deeply. And they don't always, you don't even get this in UTD, right? You might get, some of you might take a logic course, but many of you probably won't. And even if you take a logic course, they're not going to intersect that with theology and things related to Christianity and belief in God, most likely. So I think there's a lot of value in this, but it may be a little more academic than usual. We'll introduce some terminology, things like that. Some of you may already know a lot of it, but we're gonna give you part of what should be interesting today, I think, to try to make it not a dry subject. Is I'm going to throw out, like, here's an argument, find the fallacy, or maybe not all of them have fallacies, but we want to get some kind of discussion going, get you guys thinking and evaluating things critically, and seeing what's involved with that. So yeah, we don't want to be simple-minded. The scripture calls us to be deep thinkers that love God with our minds. All right, so basically what we're going to start off with is just describing different forms of reasoning. We'll describe the difference between deductive, inductive, abductive. We're going to try not to get too terminology focused, but just to give you, if you're not familiar with some of the terminology, at a light level. And then, yeah, we're going to go through a lot of these fallacies. We'll also talk about things like conspiracy theories. There's some interesting reasoning principles that come into play that if people are lacking in them, they can very easily buy into conspiracy theories. You see that come up a lot in politics or something. In fact, this whole talk is interesting, right? Coming after the political season that we're in, often the politicians are the worst at committing fallacies, and it can be interesting to think about some of what you've heard in political ads or this or that, debates with respect to some of these principles. We'll talk about the argument from silence. That's an argument that's often goes against biblical claims. I'll try to say, well, we'll get into it later. I'll just trying to give you now the outline of what we're talking about tonight. All right, I don't think we'll have time. I might make this a separate talk in its entirety, which I did 4 years ago when we were meeting remotely during COVID, but I did a talk just on Bayesian probability theory, and let me know later if that's something that might be of interest. If you really want to go deep in understanding that kind of thing, it's very, very helpful. So yeah, let's start off with looking at different kinds of reasoning. So one type would be inductive reasoning. The kind of reasoning that you got the picture here. Maybe I should have used ducks instead of swans in light of the love of ducks. What's that? Inductive. Yeah, that would have been a nice pun I could have put in there. I'll have to do that next time around here.
If you're new, you have to get used to our duck obsession.
Yes. So, okay, at one point in certain areas, people thought, oh, all swans are white. They used inductive reasoning. They see a lot of examples of swans, and they were all white. But of course, we know that there are black swans as well. It's basically starting with specific examples and moving towards generalities or using patterns to make predictions. So what field uses inductive reasoning a lot? It would be science, right? Certain branches of science especially, like say chemistry or something, or biology. All right. By contrast, deductive reasoning starts with generalities and applies them to specifics, is one way to put it. It uses rules, definitions, or properties to make inferences. The conclusions are necessarily true if you use deductive reasoning because you're working out the implications of certain things. Often though, the premises are often very hard to prove in any absolute sense, but it can still be said to be a deductive argument. So by eliminating what is false, sometimes one can deduce what must be true. So you argue from premises where you have a couple or more premises that lead to a conclusion by the rules of logic, and that would be deductive reasoning. But you're going to have to argue for the truth of those premises to make your case as well, obviously. So I thought we'd go through an example of the Kalam cosmological argument, since it's fairly simple and we didn't really talk about it this year. Like we sometimes in the past, we would have already talked about it. But this is an argument. In fact, anybody have a T-shirt on with that on tonight? I don't see any, but we would mention that on our T-shirt. But it's very simple. It says whatever begins to exist has a cause. And then the second premise is that the universe began to exist. And by universe here, we mean the totality of not just matter and energy, but even space and time. And then the conclusion would be simply that the universe has a cause, or there's a cause outside the universe for the entire universe. Okay, and then you can kind of unpack, well, what are the properties of that cause, which itself is using deductive reasoning. Well, if all of space and matter came into existence, then the cause must be outside of space. So it's spaceless. It must be immaterial. It must be enormously powerful to bring about the whole universe. And so you get a lot of the properties of God. So it's somewhat of a modest argument, though. You're not getting the specific Christian God out of the argument, but it's very powerful if someone is an atheist or naturalist for them to be presented with this argument and really try to grapple with it. We have Seth, who's a physics major here, and you're kind of specializing in cosmology, right? Are you getting into some of the different theories where people try to extend the universe into the eternal past, or does that come up? Or
not too much.
Yeah.
Also looking at the evolution of the universe since
Right, sure.
some of the non-trivialities with that.
And yeah, part of the powerful thing from that evidence is just that expansion, for example, and you play back the clock and it looks like the universe, it would have gone to a singularity. Famous physicists that everybody's heard of, like Stephen Hawking, along with Roger Penrose, proved these singularity theorems that there had to be a beginning to the universe on plausible conditions. They later generalized it. Some people thought, well, maybe those conditions have exceptions. But I think with the Bourdet-Vilenkin-Guth theorem and other principles, we now have a strong case. It's not a proof. Science is, if you're a naturalist, if you're an atheist, you're still trying to come up with some way to make the universe eternal, even if you have to posit totally new physics, which is really what they're doing. And you were mentioning how you had a friend talking about the multiverse or someone online or something. Yeah. That's a very common thing these days. People want to, I think, seeing these movies about the multiverse, people think, oh, maybe there's all these other universes, but really there's no known physics that for sure would produce a multiverse. And even if there was, there's very good reasons for thinking even the multiverse had to have a beginning. One of them we were talking about before class as just the second law, that the usable energy runs down in the universe over time. It can't have existed forever, or you wouldn't have any usable energy left. That would apply to the multiverse. This other Bourdet-Vilenkin-Guth theorem I mentioned is a little bit more esoteric, but it's one accepted by physicists that unless you think you can violate the speed of light, then you know for sure the universe can't have been around forever as long as it's expanding, and it is expanding. Anyway, probably going in a little bit too much because I'm mostly bringing this up as an example of deductive reasoning. So this is called a syllogism because you have two premises leading to a conclusion. And you can see that, if you grant the two premises, the conclusion follows. Now, the skeptic is still probably going to push back some on the implications, like, how do we know that's God and all that? But I think, you have some pretty good arguments that at least shows that this defeats naturalism or atheism. So I think it's a good argument, and it's a good example of deductive reasoning. All right, so what would y'all say is a conclusion known with certainty in a deductive argument? What do you think?
I mean, it comes down to premises.
That's right.
If the premises are true as given, then yes, in theory it should be proven as true.
Exactly, yeah, that's exactly right. So it can go wrong, obviously, either in the logical structure. You could have an invalid deductive argument, I guess, right? This is all I'm pointing out there. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. If an argument is properly formed to where the conclusion follows, if you grant the premises, it's said to be a valid argument. And if the premises are also true, it's said to be a sound argument. Okay. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit, just kind of, that terminology. The conclusion of a valid argument follows necessarily if and only if the premises are true. But there is no escape. That's what's powerful if you frame an argument as a deductive argument, is people can't just dismiss it and say, well, I don't like arguments of that kind or whatever. They have to either reject the premises or show you how this is not a valid argument. So it's a good way to focus the attention in that sense. So yeah, I mean, I've heard people try to dismiss the kalam by just saying, I don't like those kind of arguments or something, but it's like, you can't really do that. You've got to tell me which premise is wrong and why, or show me, and no one really disputes that it's a valid argument. The structure of the argument makes sense. Yeah. All right. I think most of y'all are probably familiar with Venn diagrams, but if anyone isn't, it's just one of these diagrams where it shows the relationships between entities. Okay. So in this case, this is showing that all A's are B's. Or put another way, A implies B. For example, all squares are quadrilaterals, four-sided figures. Squares also have right angles, equal length sides, etc. Whereas not all quadrilaterals do. So Venn diagrams can be helpful for evaluating deductive arguments. And yeah, there's different ways you can kind of state this relationship. You could also say A implies B, or if A, then B, or all A's are B. They're all basically equivalent. So you could draw a Venn diagram for this statement. Some, but not all Americans live in big cities. So you have partial overlap. So that's not really a good candidate for a deductive argument in that case, right? Because you can't really draw any conclusions from that. You could be an American not in a big city. You could live in a rural area. Or you could be a non-American living in a big city. There's all combinations are open. All right. What about this example? Think about how you would draw this. All mammals give birth to live offspring. The duck-billed platypus is a mammal. Therefore, the duck-billed platypus gives birth to live offspring. Is that a valid argument? It's a trick question. That's right. It's valid. But yeah, in this case, the premises are not true, which in the colloquial sense of the word valid, as some of you were probably referring to, that's right. You may know that not all mammals give birth to live offspring. The duck-billed platypus, in fact, lays eggs, which is really interesting. So it is valid argument, not sound, not a good argument. The right way to draw the picture would be like this. It's true that most mammals give birth to live offspring, but you have the egg-laying mammals called monotremes, of which one example is the duck-billed platypus. So the Venn diagram can help you kind of evaluate the deductive aspects, but you better draw it properly or it could be misleading. So a good way to assess validity. Okay, what is formal logic versus informal logic? If you're not familiar with that, we can explain that real quick. It's very simple. In formal logic, you could use symbols and you could write down these kind of relationships like P implies Q and things like that, not P. What can you just deduce from not Q? You can deal with all kinds of truth tables and different things. So formal logic is just the logic itself related to the validity and things like that. So you could write down those symbols. You could have a computer program tell you whether some huge, long, complicated thing is valid or not. But it's not going to be able to tell you if the premises or individual premises are true. But it could. They, in fact, use this for some of the complicated math proofs they do these days. They might have supercomputers running for a long time to check this really long, complicated thing to see if is it valid logically. And that's in the category then of formal logic. All right. So the example of P implies Q is known as modus ponens. And there's another common one. Well, okay, yeah, first let me mention, sometimes you might hear people refer to an antecedent and a consequent. Again, apologies if this is too much terminology. You can ignore that and just focus on the other parts of the talk. But P is the antecedent, Q is the consequent. And later we'll talk about fallacies like that have to do with denying the antecedent and things like that. So that's why those can be helpful terms to know, so that you know if someone's talking about that fallacy, what they're referring to. All right. All right. So another principle of logic would say that if you have P implies Q, if Q is false, then you know P is false. And you can see that from the Venn diagram very easily, right? Everything outside of Q doesn't include P. And this would be modus tollens, which is another just general logic principle. And this is actually the one that we used last week when we were talking about the moral argument for God's existence. So we're going to look at that briefly in a minute here too. Okay, what about, does knowledge about Q being true tell us anything about the truth of P? See some heads shaking, that's correct. Yeah, you don't really know anything from that either, do you? I'm not going to go over this slide, but I make my slides available to you all, so if you want more details about how do people use symbols in formal logic, this will be available to you. I use for negation, because I'm a computer programmer, I'm using this bang sign or not sign for my not, but often they'll use tildes for the nots. All right, so here's what was presented last week. We were talking about moral relativism and the moral argument for God's existence, which C.S. Lewis was a really good advocate for. It goes like this: if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. So you can see how this is very much in that modus ponens, or modus tollens rather, form. Okay. Now you could argue about the truth of these premises, but the logic itself is indisputable. If you grant those two premises, God would have to exist if you acknowledge that objective morality exists. Okay. And so the key way of establishing that is just asking people if they want to say that you can have objective morality without God. How do you defend that in an atheistic world? Everything would be sort of person relative. All the morals that we believe would have been products of some kind of evolutionary or cultural process. Those change over time. They don't seem to be objective. They seem to be subjective, person relative. There's some pretty good arguments for it, but you can't prove it 100% to everyone's satisfaction. Some people would just deny there's any objective morality, and they could be a consistent atheist. But what the deductive argument like this is really trying to help is just trying to unpack, like, if you really believe those things, you have to believe in God. It's kind of helping people make that connection, which they may or may not make. Sometimes people have actually online, internet infidels have confused deductive reasoning with circular reasoning. They're like, oh, well, your premises, the conclusion is already sort of wrapped up in the premises. And they would even complain about, like, the famous one, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. They would say, yeah, that's not valid either. But that's a classic philosophy 101 example for modus ponens. But yeah, there's nothing circular about it, but there is a sense in which the conclusion is tied into the premise. So you're just trying to help people realize if you grant these premises, the conclusion is inescapable. I think that's the way to think about it. All right, let's talk about fallacies. And here we can have some fun with just different fallacies that you would encounter. Again, we could distinguish between formal fallacies and informal fallacies. So formal fallacies would be fallacious reasoning, something going against formal logic, the kind of things that a computer program could detect from symbols of logic. Okay, so one of them is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. So remember, if you have P implies Q, or all P's are Q, The consequent is the second one of those, the consequence, if you will. So that's the Q part. And so again, the fallacy of affirming the consequent would just be saying you're trying to draw some conclusion from the knowledge that Q is true. But as is especially evident if you're just looking, at the Venn diagram, just by knowing Q is true tells you nothing about P. I mean, it might in a probabilistic sense if you knew how big P was and how big Q was. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about deductive reasoning. You can't draw any firm conclusion just by knowing Q. To do otherwise would be to commit the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Is that making sense? So a common example used for this fallacy would be, if it is raining, the streets will be wet. The streets are wet, therefore it is raining. Superficially, that could sound somewhat plausible if you're not really thinking about it carefully, but obviously you could have sprinklers come on, make the street wet. There's other ways streets could be wet other than raining. So that's a good example of the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Okay, the other sort of main formal fallacy at the most foundational level, introductory level, you could say would be denying the antecedent. So the antecedent is the first part of it. P implies Q, all P's are Q. That would mean then that you're saying P is false. What can I conclude from P is false? Look at the Venn diagram. If you have P is false, it doesn't really tell you anything for sure about Q. You could be in the part of P is false that's in the not Q, or the Q is true part of the Venn diagram. No way to conclude anything. So that's denying the antecedent. So sometimes people do fall into that trap. It can be more subtle. Thinking if P implies Q, that not P implies not Q. Or they might even be confusing it with modus tollens. But in modus tollens, you're denying the consequent, not the antecedent. So that's the difference. All right, now we're going to go through a number of these examples. I'll let you guys comment on what is this fallacy. Many of you will know them by name. If you don't, that's fine too. You can just explain in words, what do you find fallacious with this? Or maybe nothing. Okay, the first one, if it is a car, it has wheels. It does not have wheels, therefore it is not a car. Fallacy or not? Yep, no fallacy there. That's just modus tollens. That's a real simple one. Trick question. If we found evidence that the stars said God exists, we would know God exists. We have no such evidence, therefore God doesn't exist. Thoughts on that one? How would you respond if someone brought up that? Or maybe it's a little bit different. Maybe it's a little subtler. For example, the hiddenness of God is a common objection, right? If God, there is a probabilistic version of this that we would need to respond to, even if there's no fallacy there. But people would just say, like, God could have made himself a lot more known, but he didn't. And so I don't believe in God. And they might try to also say, well, we would expect that he would have. That's the part that needs to be unpacked in depth. So that's similar to this. Thoughts on this one? Perfect. Very good. Yeah. Not P doesn't allow us to draw any conclusions. Yes, it's true that if God existed, that the stars said that, we would have this knowledge. He could have done it. He didn't. But who says God has to have done that? There's no deductive argument there for him having to do it.
If the stars said that I had an iPhone, that would prove that would indicate at least that I have an iPhone, right? Or that I might.
It would be very interesting.
But I assume you're proud that you don't. But I assume you're proud that you don't.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
All right. Much more interesting will be the informal fallacies we can get to now. So we looked at the two formal fallacies. Informal fallacies could take a wider range of problems. It's often the way people are reasoning about the content of an argument, things like that. It's not necessarily a flaw in the structure of the argument itself, but how one argues for the premises. I mean, it's going to be messed up in some sense. but it's much broader. Someone tell me, what is the straw man fallacy? This is a well-known one.
Misrepresent the other team's argument to be as weak as it possibly can.
Yes. Yes, my friend Mason, by the way, y'all should get to know him. He goes to my church. Great guy, just got out of A&M and engineering, and glad to have you here, Mason. Yeah, you're constructing a straw man. It's easy to beat down a straw man. It's not representative of the real case the other side has made. You see that in politics a lot, right? Both sides are like putting the other person's arguments in the worst possible light and killing that straw man. Okay, what about ad hominem fallacy? Also one you see a ton in politics, by the way.
Only bad people mention that fallacy, so let's not talk about it.
That's right.
Only bad people mention that fallacy. Alan mentioned it, therefore Alan is bad.
That does follow as a valid argument, yes. What about people who teach against it? Is that still bad? All right, yeah, so this one literally means to the man. So in this case, you're really not even giving an argument. You're just trying to undermine something by attacking the person. And so you see that a lot, I think, in intelligent design. We've had in like Casey Luskin, we had some people giving some biological argument. Often they'll be just trying to argue science as PhD scientists, but people will just be trying to like, oh, you want to just get creation in the schools, or they're trying to redirect it and attack the person often. You're just religiously motivated or something like that. It has nothing to do with the argument. So if someone really has the goods in defeating some argument, why not just say, this is why you're wrong. You know, here's the flaw in your reasoning. Let's focus on that. Let's not focus on the person. And actually, like if you go, I took an online philosophy class, and one of their points was the principle of the most charitable interpretation. When you're talking with people, you want to give them the benefit of the doubt. You want to assume the most charitable interpretation. Or we'll use the terminology, we want to steel man the arguments from the other side instead of straw man. Let's see if we can reason against it even if in its strongest form. That's what makes the most sense, right? If you're really trying to find truth. All right, we're going to go through a bunch of other ones, but those are some examples. The other ones, I'm just going to give you the example, see if you can name it or describe it, and then we'll go from there. But before we do that, I do want to introduce briefly a third kind of reasoning, which would be abductive reasoning. Okay, so this would be an inference to the best explanation is a good synonym phrase for that. So we use this commonly in everyday life or in things like science or history especially uses this a lot. You can't go into the lab and do experiments in history. You can't use induction like you can in science. You're just trying to reason from here's this available evidence from ancient writings and archaeology, what best explains those facts. And you can look at different principles within that. Yes?
So an example of abductive reasoning would be the skies are gray, the streets are wet, I heard thunder earlier, therefore it rained.
Yeah, you could combine different things and say the best explanation that fits all those facts would be that. One example to give you would be that in the 1800s, Uranus's orbit was discovered to deviate from different predictions. At that time, they just knew about Newton's theory of gravity, and it didn't really match that. So some of the options were Newton's theory of gravity is wrong, or maybe there is another planet we haven't discovered yet. They went out and looked, and they discovered Neptune as this 8th planet. Interestingly, though, the opposite was true for the orbit of Mercury when they couldn't explain that by Newtonian gravity. It was like, oh, you need relativity for explaining that orbit. So, all right, here's some principles for abductive reasoning. And we've talked about this sometimes as we're going through like historical arguments, like we talk about things related to how do we know we can trust the Gospels or evidence for the resurrection. We'll talk about the explanatory scope of different hypotheses. Does the proposed theory account for all the evidence? So when we're talking about the resurrection, we'll try to lay out different facts like the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and things like that, and try to say, look, the best explanation of those is that Jesus was actually raised from the dead. You're trying to account for all the evidence. You're laying out a number of different facts. There's also explanatory power. Does the theory make the data probable? You could have just said, well, I think aliens took the body of Jesus or something like that. It's like, well, that's not the best theory. It's possible, but is it reasonable? You want to look at simplicity, not multiplying explanatory entities beyond what is necessity, according to Occam's razor. It's a principle that could have exceptions, right? But it's a principle that is used within science. It's kind of a good rule of thumb. It ties into Bayes' theorem, actually, because every time, if you have to have something else to explain something, there's a certain probability associated with that, and you have to chain all those together. So if you have a bunch of them, there's more chances of just the improbabilities overcoming, making that a probable explanation. All right. Now notice in apologetics, we often want to use, and really in any branch, anything you guys might be studying, you're often going to use all of these forms of reasoning. So Dr. Craig, Hainline Craig, who kind of founded our Reasonable Faith chapters, he's famous for the Kalam cosmological argument, which, by the way, it is the most discussed argument in the philosophy of religion now. And if you go back like many decades, it was hardly discussed at all. So that's pretty cool. But the argument itself dates way, way back to early Jewish, Christian, Muslim philosophers. But in making the deductive argument, he argues for the truth of the premises by bringing in abductive reasoning. So he's trying to establish things about those premises. For example, the first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause. He argues that we don't really have any exceptions to that principle that you could point to anywhere in the universe. Things just don't pop into existence out of nothing. And no quantum particles are not an exception to that because they come from the quantum vacuum. And yeah, it's not from nothing. And so he's saying, look, this is most reasonable to believe in this premise. He's not asking you to believe it 100%, but he's saying this makes a good deductive argument for God because you have much more reason for believing the premise than not. Okay, and that's all you're looking for in one of these kinds of arguments. Scientists may end up using a lot of deductive reasoning, but ultimately they're not able to rely solely, I would say, on deductive reasoning because you're always tying into observations. Your observations could be incomplete. Your theories could be incomplete. And so you're always having to have some inductive and abductive reasoning. For Christianity, I would argue that we make a cumulative case argument. We're not relying on any one argument for the existence of God or the truth of Christianity, but we're chaining together a large number of things that all point in that same direction and make a very powerful case together. And so the overall case is largely one of abductive reasoning, I would say. Now, some would argue against that. For example, since we're talking about the cosmological argument tonight a lot, I hear this a lot if I present the Kalam to skeptics. They'll say, well, why are you even bringing this up? You believe in the Christian God, and this argument you just gave me doesn't establish the existence of the Christian God. At most, it would give you some kind of generic deistic God or something like that. How would you guys respond to that objection?
I never said it did.
Yeah. Okay. And why would you defend that? Like, why would you defend that we don't need for it to do that?
In order for someone to accept that the resurrection is even a possibility, they couldn't continue to accept naturalism. So proving that there has to exist something, at least one thing not described by the natural universe.
Very well put,
would
Rob.
make the resurrection more possible.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a great argument for refuting naturalism, I think. And that's a key step, especially because often the skeptics you're talking to are naturalists, right? They're atheists. They don't believe in God, and that's why they're like so dismissive about the resurrection. So you might have to first deal with, hey, have you thought about this argument? And get them to really think through and grapple with that honestly. And yeah, by the way, I mean, you do get some, as we talked about, you get some attributes about God from it. You just don't get whether it's the Christian God or the Muslim God or the Jewish God, which, of course, we think as Christians, there's the same God of Judaism and Christianity, but not Islam, because there's different properties they would ascribe to Allah than we would. So yeah, I mean, think about this. You're in a murder trial or something, you'll often see a lot of people dealing with small pieces of evidence, part of a cumulative case. Okay, the defense might be arguing, my client is innocent, this person died of natural causes or something. Well, if they're arguing that, it's very important for you to maybe first show that, no, we know this person did not die of natural causes, that they were actually murdered. And it would be unfair then, right, if the defense started off arguing that way, you're coming back and refuting that, for them to just say, well, but you haven't proved my client killed him. I mean, it's true, but you're not done yet either. I mean, they were the ones that were trying to say the client died of natural causes, and it was very important to refute that as part of a cumulative case. So I think it's actually part of the strength of our argument we would make for Christianity, that you have all these independent lines of evidence that work together. And even if one of them fails, you still have a good case. Maybe I'm wrong about the kalam, but if I still have the moral argument and other ones, fine-tuning, whatever, I still have a good overall case for the existence of God, the possibility of miracles, and you can work from there. This is kind of just an interesting tidbit, but you can actually have evidence that you would expect on a theory and still show that that theory is almost certainly false. Consider the following scenario. I have an urn in which I'm going to contain a bunch of balls. And one possibility is that, or maybe I have two urns, say one of them is only black balls. So I've got a bunch of them in there, they're just all black. The other one, I have 2/3 of the balls are black and 1/3 of them are white. So we draw a ball at random, shake it up, and then we note what color it is. We put it back in the urn, mix it up, shake it up. Okay, as you start picking out black balls, that's expected under either scenario, right? It's more likely from urn A or urn B that you get a black ball. Just in one case, it's every time you have to get a black ball. And in the other case, it's 2/3 of the time. So obviously, if you drew a white one, you'd know right away that you don't have urn A, you have urn B. But as you draw black balls, it's very probabilistic. It's a simple math equation in this case, because you're replacing them and everything, where you have a 2/3 chance. And so, I mean, you could do the math. But think about this. If you had 50 balls drawn in a row and they were all black, you still don't know for sure which urn you have, but you have only a 1 in 1.6 billion chance it's from urn B at that point. It's almost certainly from urn A. So you can have very strong evidence in a cumulative case sense, even from things that themselves were not very good evidence, right? You wouldn't call that good evidence, like, hey, this doesn't distinguish which urn it was from very well by itself as just one piece. Now, I think when we're giving the kalam or the moral argument, it actually is way better than that, right? So the cumulative case argument that we can make is very powerful. And we're going to talk about fine-tuning in the spring. Seth's going to do that one. I'm excited about that. And that's a case where, too, we have all these different constants of nature that had to be finely tuned for life to exist anywhere in the universe. And so you have this cumulative case. You could throw out some of them, be wrong about some of them. It doesn't do away with the power of your case. And in those cases, some of them are like 1 in 10 to the 30th power, things like that. All right, let's go back to the fallacy game. Someone says, I know people who have read the Bible but got nothing out of it. Therefore, there is nothing to be gained from reading the Bible. How do you respond? Sort of, yeah, I would say that definitely fits. There is a particular fallacy. Does anybody happen to know the name of it? That is what I was going for. Perfect. Yeah. And notice also, though, this is not even really a deductive argument. Maybe that's why you were saying, it's kind of more inductive, right? There weren't like two premises that lead by modus ponens or modus tollens to a conclusion. They're more just like generalizing too quickly from a very limited sample size. Okay, so that would be sort of the fallacy of hasty generalization.
It can also be pretty easily disproven by saying, well, I know people who have read the Bible and gained something from it.
There you go. Yeah, it's a good point. That'd also be good to say, obviously.
I would be equally as credible as they are.
That's right. change the stats they're aware of. I would also say that, just as a slight tangent here, but interestingly, the Bible itself, it certainly doesn't claim that everybody's going to be affected in a positive way by it. It talks about how people will reject it and so forth and not understand it, and how there's an element of you need to be seeking the truth to find it. And so it's actually predicted in the Bible itself that many people would read it and get nothing out of it. So that's interesting. All right, here's another one. The Bible was written by people. People are not God. Therefore, the Bible is not God's word. This one's a little harder to say as a particular fallacy by name, but I'm going to go with one. But yeah, what do you think on this one?
They don't directly connect, because on there, the second premise is that people are not God, but then the conclusion is that it's not God's word.
Yes.
Those two are not the same thing. There's a difference between God and God's word.
Very good, yeah. Yeah. So this is sort of like the fallacy of equivocation. Like if you're using the same word in two different ways, that's called the fallacy of equivocation. It's a little bit implicit here. So yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Yeah, the Christian view is not that God just, made the writers right. Yeah, that's actually the Muslim view. They think that Muhammad was given this word for word thing, and that's actually existed from all eternity. The Christian view, other than a few things like, say, the Ten Commandments, God wrote directly, but almost all of the Bible, it's more that he inspired. You can see the humanness in the writings, and it's still inspired, it's still true and trustworthy, but there's different styles and personalities you can see even within the Bible. This also, you could say, is a straw man, I guess, because you're arguing against something that's not something Christians actually believe. So in that sense, it fits. Okay, what about this one? The Bible says it was inspired by God. The Bible is true in everything it claims. Therefore, the Bible was inspired by God. You might hear this in some churches occasionally. It is, yeah. Yeah, it's very circular there.
How do we know that premise 2 is true?
Yeah, you're assuming the conclusion almost and affirming the premises. So this, a lot of ways people talk about circular reasoning is the fallacy of question begging. If you hear of a philosopher say the word begging the question, they're not using it in the same sense that like people do in the popular world, like, oh, that begs the question, that makes you think of the question. They're more saying that it's circular reasoning. So that's good to be aware of. Many of you probably already were, but whenever someone is, if the only reason they can give for accepting one of the premises is they're already committed to believing the conclusion, then that could be said to be circular reasoning. You need to have independent reasons for believing the premises, not just that you're committed to the truth of the conclusion. So obviously we can, and we try to do this in this group, make a case for biblical inspiration that avoids circular reasoning. So we argue from the Bible's accuracy, its validation from history and archaeology, as well as then showing that if Jesus raised from the dead, then whatever he says goes. And if he's affirming the Bible as God's word, that's really important. So that would be more of how we would try to make that case. What about this one? The Bible claims that God has performed miracles, but science has shown miracles cannot happen. Therefore, the Bible is false. Again, this is a pretty common one, I think. How would y'all respond to that?
They're called miracles because science can't prove them.
Okay, yeah, it's
I would be more concerned to prove they could.
yeah. Okay, good point as well. Other thoughts?
Have all knowledge.
That second premise is really hard to prove.
Yeah, there you go. Very good.
Scientific method can't really prove an impossibility, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you were saying, like the white swan, black swan thing. Like you can't rule out a black swan.
Yeah, science can't even rule that the laws of physics won't change over time and things like that. You can't. People actually study that. You can find articles where they're trying to see, have the constants varied in time or space in the universe, and it's pretty interesting.
Is there a particular term for that why it's so much more difficult to prove
Prove a negative.
Prove a negative, yeah.
I don't know of a particular term. I don't know if anyone else does, but
I've heard of it as like the hidden teapot conundrum, kind of like if there's a
Bertrand Russell's famous analogy, yeah.
Yeah, if there's a tea kettle in the orbit of Saturn, how do you prove that it's not there?
Yeah.
You wouldn't be expected to be able to detect it, at least at that time. All right, yeah, so I like what you're saying. You know, I would say, look, premise 2 is clearly false. Science itself is not really geared towards, detecting whether or not a miracle can happen. Anyway, say they rephrase it though, science has shown, even if they do that, then they're still in, I mean, that's still kind of clearly false, I think, but they could soften it a little bit and say we have this long, what a lot of them will say is, right, we have this long history of scientific study and we never see miracles. And of course they're denying any reported miracle. There's actually even scientific journals where they have reported miracles, but you can just ignore all the evidence and you can say there's no evidence. Anyway, yeah, so it's somewhat in the category possibly of begging the question, even at its most charitable interpretation. All right, here's another common line of argumentation that I've seen. People will say that many or most top scientists don't believe in God. Some will point to this famous stat from the National Academy of Sciences from years ago that, hey, there was only 11% of them. And one of the atheist horsemen, I forget which one, said, and it's very annoying to them that even 11% believed or something, but then they could say, well, scientists are among the smartest people in the world. If many of the smartest people in the world don't believe in God, it must be unreasonable. How would you respond to that? Rob?
It's an argument from authority. There was a time in which the smartest people in the world believed the earth was flat.
Okay, that's actually a pretty good response.
And
yeah.
a time when they all believed in God.
Yeah, I would say this is sort of the fallacy of appeal to authority. This one's kind of interesting because it's often good to appeal to authorities if they're really experts in the field, right? That's the key differentiator. And even there, you have to deal with, could the experts be wrong? Seth?
Yeah, but I feel like the problem with this is assuming that, I mean, what do we mean by smartest here? We're meaning people most apt in performing science. Are these it doesn't necessarily follow that these are the best people to be making to be making some kind of reasoned claim on a theological matter. Like it doesn't follow
That's
that
right.
they're also going to be most apt to make that decision.
Excellent
We
point.
don't exactly have an objective way to measure intelligence. The closest that we have was explicitly designed by eugenicists to prove that a certain race of people were smarter than the others. Begs the question.
Yeah, that makes it pretty unreliable then, doesn't it?
That's also an ad hominem fallacy, too.
True, yeah.
Isn't that hominem fallacy to say that the argument is invalid because he is a eugenicist, but it is accurate to say that because he already had a conclusion in mind when designing his metric is likely invalid because it was designed to produce a certain sort of result.
That's a good response because, yeah, you're saying that they had this other agenda that wasn't geared towards optimizing the ability to detect intelligence necessarily.
Also is the fallacy to claim that because an argument has a fallacy, it is invalid.
That's what I said.
Yeah, actually notice in this, and we live in a culture that esteems scientists, I think, too much. And this was actually one of the things that impacted me when I went through a period of doubts. As someone studying science, I held too high a view of atheistic scientists or whatever. It kind of made me question things more than it should because to Seth's point, there's a couple things. First of all, even really smart people can be rebellious against God or can be influenced by bias and things like that. And how does that really comport with their training? Nothing in their training is geared towards helping them understand the arguments for God's existence or things like that. What discipline is that does that? There actually is one in academia. It's philosophy of religion. Rob, what else?
I think it would be a bit of a misrepresentation to say that belief in God decisions whether or not to seek God are based only on reason.
Right.
I think there's a fair amount of people that are led to it by emotionality.
Yeah, that's all I was trying to say as well. It's just that there are other reason-oriented factors that can come into play, and anything that has those kind of implications. Maybe someone doesn't want a cosmic authority to submit to. They want to live their life how they want to. I mean, we have to all admit we have part of that in us, right? We want to go our own way. So yeah, the scientific training, it's all geared towards the material world. There's nothing in that where they're considering anything about evaluating whether God exists or not, or they're not even really allowed to talk about that hardly. So they're not trained in that. I mean, at least the philosophy of religion, and by the way, they did a recent study, and 71% of the people in that field actually do believe in God. So, I mean, still, I can't really put much weight in that though, right? Argument from authority, but it is interesting that those who study that, and there may be a selection effect there actually as well. Like if you believe in God and you're studying philosophy, you might want to go into that part of it more. But likewise, if you're a materialist, if you believe matter is all there is, you're probably more likely to go into science if you want to get to the foundations of ultimate truth because you think all the answers are there. So there is, and actually there's Elaine Eklund, a sociologist at Rice University. She did a study of scientists and religious beliefs, and she showed that actually most people who are atheist scientists were that way before they went into science. There's almost no trend line of them losing their faith while they're scientists. So there probably is somewhat of a selection effect. And of course the 11% is pretty bogus because that's a small select group that, according to Jim Tour, this famous Rice chemist, he was excluded from the National Academy of Sciences because people knew he was arguing against a naturalistic origin of life. So there's a selection effect that's even worse there. I think most scientists, it's more like 50% or something believe in God. So still lower than the general public, but yeah, it is what it is. All right, how about this one? Christianity isn't true. You just believe it because you were raised in America. If you were raised in India, you would be a Hindu.
Genetic fallacy.
Very good.
If I believed that the world was round because it was revealed to me in a dream, would that make the world flat?
Okay. Very good, yeah. The classic example of the genetic fallacy. It's also false, right? Obviously, there's Christians who were raised that way in India, and we have some that come to our group from time to time. Thank you, Dathan. Stevenson's not here today, but he would be another example. So it's irrational to reject a belief solely because of how that belief originated. That's what the genetic fallacy is really trying to get at. Okay. You may or may not know this, but I found this interesting a few years ago when I learned it. But okay, we all accept the Pythagorean theorem, right? That the hypotenuse of a triangle has this relationship of the sum of the squares and so forth. But there was actually, that was a very mystical movement in ancient Greece associated with Pythagoras. And it became a religion. He was like deified. So there were people living in ancient Greece that only believed the Pythagorean theorem, not because they worked out the proof or thought about it, but they thought this guy was a deity. So they probably believed it on some totally bogus basis. But that doesn't make the Pythagorean theorem false, right? So that's an example of where the genetic fallacy can go wrong. But you can talk, and this is you can talk about how something originated if you're trying to just undermine the rationality for trusting it totally. Like maybe we're talking about the origination of the IQ test or something. If you could show that the people that wrote that were not seeking truth, that would undermine it in some sense. Okay, let's talk a bit about conspiracy theories. You guys know people that buy into too many conspiracy theories, and it's frustrating to try to argue with them, right? That 9/11 wasn't a hoax or whatever. Why is that? What do? They deny. They're just saying, well, it's all rigged. The conspiracy makes all the evidence look one way. It's just like you can't really reason with them. So they're giving you essentially a lot of ad hoc reasons for why the theory can be supported without any real evidence. Or maybe they'll point to a few pieces of very bad evidence or something. But so how do you argue against this? All right, here's some thoughts I had from J. Warner Wallace, the homicide detective. It's pretty good on this because he's dealt with people conspiring to commit crimes and things like that. And it's pretty interesting. So yeah, you really want to look at, is there positive evidence for conspiracy? Is it really plausible in convincing neutral experts? You want to look at, and this is what he really harps on, how many people were involved in conspiracy. He says, yeah, if you have two people conspiring and one kills the other, you've got a very good chance of getting away with that conspiracy. Okay, but if it's something like, say, 9/11 or something, you've got the whole government, you've got this huge government entity, or the moon landings or something. How do you keep... What's that?
Surely they would have come out in this noted leak.
That's right. There you go. Yeah, there was a lot leaked there. So the number of people, how long they have to keep it for, what is the relationship of the people? Do they have an incentive for or against the conspiracy theory? So, some people would say the disciples conspired to fake the resurrection of Jesus, right? That's one of the ones that comes into play. But we can look at the fact that you had really more than 12 disciples that were all attesting to it for their whole lives. It wasn't short. And they had a lot of reason to actually go against the conspiracy. They could have saved their lives in many cases. So that makes it pretty hard to view that as a conspiracy by this kind of reasoning. All right, yeah. So one of the things you want to look at, for example, in 9/11, well, the Obama Justice Department coming in later, they would have access to a lot of the records, and you have some of the same people that span administrations. They would have known if there was something fishy, and they would have been more than happy to say, hey, this previous Republican presidency was horrible, look what they did. They would be more than happy to expose it. Or in the case of the moon landing, the Russians, they're monitoring all kinds of stuff associated with rocket launches, looking for nukes. They know what's going on with the US. None of them tried to claim the moon landing was a hoax, and they would have had it been.
No, the Russians were in on it with the US.
That's right.
The evidence for the firmament, which will prove that God is real.
Okay. Yeah, that's the thing with a conspiracy, right? You always you tack on, oh, they're in on it too, right? But again, the bigger it becomes, the harder it is to pull it off. I like this quote from Chuck Colson, the famous convert to Christianity who was guilty of the conspiracy of Watergate. He said, I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they had seen Jesus raised from the dead, and then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured it if they weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles can keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. So just kind of an interesting tidbit from history there. All right, let's see how we're doing on time. About out of time, but we could go through this one last case or thing that we should think through from a reasoning standpoint. So one of the arguments sometimes levied against Christianity fits into this category of arguments from silence. The Bible should have talked about this or that, or various things. So this is a case where we don't have something recorded historically, and someone's trying to say, look, if that was true, we would have it. A classic example actually is the Jesus mythicists are kind of in this camp. So this is the group of people, I won't call them scholars because they're not very scholarly. There's really no historian teaching at a university in the whole world that believes Jesus didn't exist. But there are a few people who have written books and appear on podcasts who have said that they believe there's insufficient evidence to think Jesus even lived. It's not enough for them to just say that he's not God or didn't raise from the dead. They want to say he didn't even live. But if you look carefully at their writings, it becomes downright humorous. So there's one guy, Michael, I don't know how you say that last name, Polkovich. He provided a list of all these things. He's like, look, I've got a list of 126 authors that would have written about Jesus had he really lived in this era. But someone actually took the time to look through his list in detail and document what he said. And so, interestingly, 47 of them we don't even have the writings. So, like, of course, we don't have any writings about Jesus from those authors. Nobody has an extant copy today of those works. And then many of them actually died before Jesus was born. So it's like, come on, this is ridiculous. And some referenced authors who, if you write about just like, say, farming or gynecology, it's not likely that you would talk about Jesus of Nazareth in that kind of a book. So these are just totally bogus. But even those writing history, there's reasons for thinking, were they aware of Jesus at that time? Or did it get their radar? First century Palestine, that was Roman backwaters area, right? That wasn't the center of the Roman Empire. That wasn't what the scholarly elites really cared about. It was more of this area that was just, oh, we don't care about those Jews over there. We're too sophisticated. We're not going to be writing about them or following the details. And yet, nonetheless, as I shared even in week 1, we have Roman historians like Tacitus. I have Jewish historians like Josephus that do talk about Jesus, talk about him being crucified under Pontius Pilate, and this spreading quickly all the way to Rome. So we have actually pretty good evidence of Jesus from secular sources outside the Bible.
And these would be hostile sources that if they
Yeah.
existed, presumably would have been very eager to point it out, the same way the Soviets would be eager to point out a hoax movement.
Good point. Yeah, that's a good criteria of evaluation. So, yeah. So I think not only do the Jesus mythicists fail spectacularly, but you want to be careful with arguments from silence. Tim McGrew is really good on this topic. Some of y'all have heard him as one of our expert speakers, and he has this long litany of examples, and he can email you like 100 like this. But he's like, Marco Polo never visited, or he visited China, of course, traveling from Europe, I think Italy, right? But he never mentioned the Great Wall of China. This big thing, hundreds of miles long, never mentioned it. Mount Vesuvius is interesting because we knew there was a volcano, there was some information, but no historical writings mentioned that these cities were buried, Pompeii and Herculaneum, and that killed all these people. No one knew that until they discovered it and dug it up years later. That's why it's kind of really interesting to go visit there. Grant's diary, day by day, he talks about everything going on in the Civil War. And you just see all these details, and it's a daily thing. But he never mentions the Emancipation Proclamation. Why is that? You can't really say it didn't happen. What's that?
Abraham Lincoln didn't exist.
That's right, yes. There's a famous Facebook group that was kind of mocking the A-Lincolnists, trying to use these kind of things there. So in particular, if you want to make arguments from silence about first century Palestinian writings, you have several problems. There weren't many writings in general from the area. Most of them that we have didn't survive. We know the books were written because authors mention the book names, but we don't have the extant copies. And then, as I already mentioned, it's sort of the backwaters. So anyway, we're out of time, but I hope you've enjoyed getting some. Let's take a question or two, and then we'll wrap it up.
Also, we have 4 writings.
We do. We very much do, yes. And it's illegitimate to dismiss those just because you're like, oh, well, they're religiously motivated or something. Well,
Would they have been if they hadn't witnessed the resurrection?
exactly, yeah. I mean, if the resurrection really happened, people that witnessed it would tend to be Christians.
Is it biased to agree with your own writing?
That's right. I mean, if you want to read about baseball, you're reading stuff written by baseball enthusiasts. If you want to read about any subject, you're always going to read by people who are enthusiasts in that area.
Or just really, really hate it, theoretically?
Actually, that's a good point as well. All right, we are out of time. So it's back to Brahms tonight.
Good. Thank you, Ellen.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for coming, and hope to see you all next week. If not at Brahms, come on out.
And let me know if anybody's a UTD student and is willing to help me with that thing.